In 1971, researchers gave a group of college students absolute, unchecked authority over their peers in a simulated prison. Within days, those playing the guards began devising ways to humiliate and dehumanize their prisoners. The experiment demonstrated that when a system grants one group total power over another, abuse becomes a predictable, functional outcome of that environment. This dynamic is not confined to a 1970s basement. It replicates itself whenever there is a massive imbalance of power, including the sterile environment of a modern doctor's office. When the guards hold medical degrees, the patient with a complex chronic illness effectively becomes a prisoner in their own care. This silhouette represents a patient with severe, verifiable physical illnesses, like multiple sclerosis. Notice how objective physical damage, like brain lesions, disappears behind a layer of red psychological labels. Patients enter the clinic seeking treatment for a failing body, but find themselves treated as hostile inmates who require behavioral management. Categorizing a patient as complex allows a clinic to move away from the expensive, time-consuming work of diagnosis and into the streamlined world of behavioral control. It is faster to chart a personality disorder than it is to treat a failing immune system. In a prison, guards strip inmates of their names to remove their humanity. In medicine, that process happens through the chart. Providers use formal psychological testing to generate permanent labels, stamping a patient's record with terms like factitious disorder or malingerer. These poison pills act as a permanent instruction manual. They give subsequent doctors administrative permission to ignore a patient's physical reality. In one case, a patient's verifiable physical paralysis from MS was officially documented by a psychiatrist as a metaphor for feeling emotionally dependent. The chart creates a fictionalized version of the patient. Once that fiction is written, the patient becomes a prisoner of their own medical record. When a prisoner pushes back against an abusive guard, the system calls it a riot. When a patient uses their own knowledge to advocate for their body, providers flag it as manipulation. This flowchart illustrates a specific catch-22 in pain management. It traps the patient regardless of how they express their suffering. If a patient outwardly shows their agony, doctors pathologize the reaction, labeling them histrionic or borderline. If the patient shuts down or dissociates to cope with the trauma, doctors withhold pain relief, citing their quietness as proof that the pain isn't real. Because the system demands absolute compliance, self-advocacy becomes a punishable offense. The patient is left with no safe way to exist in their own body. To manage complex patients, some providers use a technique called gray rocking. By intentionally offering zero emotional response, they strip away the patient's connection to help. Providers use these tactics to ignore physical emergencies by reframing them as emotional dysregulation that the patient must simply learn to tolerate. In one instance, a doctor intentionally withdrew a patient's vital sleep medication to motivate them to follow a specific behavioral plan, essentially experimenting with their biological stability. In another, a clinic forced a patient to walk on a broken bone for 4 weeks. Because her pain was preemptively dismissed as psychosomatic, the staff offered reassurance instead of an X-ray. Instead of fixing the biological failure, the system demands the patient become a better victim, one who can endure physical agony without complaining. This matrix demonstrates the epistemic trap, where the patient's truth cannot be heard because the system's filter is too strong. "I am in pain" translates to drug seeking. "My chart is wrong" translates to resisting treatment. The patient is trapped in a closed loop. Their desperate requests for relief are the exact evidence used to deny them care. Surviving this system comes at a high daily cost. Patients are forced to mask the true severity of their physical crashes. They must hide their tremors and their immobility just to maintain a baseline of care. Asking for help becomes a risk they can no longer afford to take. The Stanford Prison Experiment only stopped when an outside observer looked at the environment and pointed out the horrific reality of what was happening inside. In medicine, the chart is the weapon. Challenging the fiction written in those records is the only way to restore the observer's perspective and the patient's safety. When medical systems prioritize compliance and liability over human reality, demanding absolute accountability is the only path toward genuine healing.